learning about them really moved me, and it's looking at all the documentary news footage of how all these young people came together and created these human chains to salvage so much literary and artistic patrimony from the flooded, sort of reserves of Florence. And
Yes.
that is incredibly moving. But then juxtapose that with the same Italy today, which will let people
Yes.
drown en masse in the
Hmm.
seas and
Right.
come up with all kinds of reasons why they don't deserve to be taken in or saved. And it's a cultural there's a cultural bias toward objects and things, like, glorifying objects and things and necessarily
Right.
separating the idea of what a human
From
being is,
humanity.
so that they don't have to acknowledge that these human beings, that they have, if anything, like a moral connection, an ethical
Right.
connection with these
Mhm.
human beings.
Yes.
And this is something that really bothers me even as a scholar, right? The idea of always focusing on the archival and the objectness of
Right.
things and
Yeah.
completely ignoring the lived experience.
Right. Right. And this is what, because not only is there the tremendous discrimination against Africans, it's also against the Roma.
Hmm.
And what I've been so delighted with is my group of Roma were restoring Donatello's pulpit in Prato,
Hmm.
and he was excellent. He was the son of a top coppersmith. In
Hmm.
his part of Romania, he has a technical school degree, and
Hmm.
he's inherited his grandfather's tools.
Hmm.
And there he was doing things which the Italian restorers didn't know how to do.
Hmm.
And he was asked to work because he was quicker than the Italians, and they needed the pulpit in time
Hmm.
for the Pope
Hmm.
to bless the people from it. And it
Hmm.
was quite clear if they did it with the Italian restorers, it wouldn't be ready in time. And also,
Hmm.
he's done the facsimile of the Libro del Chiodo twice,
Hmm.
gave a
Hmm.
copy to the Museo a Casa di Dante, and the other I'm going to
Hmm.
give to the Società Dantesca.
Oh,
But
fantastic.
what I've been doing is involving people whom Italians consider to be at the bottom, and it's true
Hmm.
they are, most of them, illiterate. But
Hmm.
I've been discovering that they've got whole oral libraries of
Hmm.
stories,
Hmm. Hmm.
and I've been able to explain that, trying to show how our common humanity is our greatest value.
Yes.
And yes, and one of the things that did amaze me when I first came to Italy, I was 21,
Hmm.
and my father took me to he was a journalist in Rome, and he took me to an important event.
Hmm.
And I was coming from America at a time before civil rights,
Hmm.
where it would be impossible for a black person to be in a position of honor.
Hmm.
And there was this absolutely beautiful woman. And my father explained, a young woman, that she was the daughter of this Italian important general who had been
Hmm.
in Ethiopia. And he had brought her back and raised her as Italian, and she was equal with the whites.
Hmm.
And that to me was, an opening.
Hmm.
And I do see Italy does have the capacity to. There's so many Africans in the paintings, in the Fra
Hmm.
Angelicas and
Hmm.
Benozza Gozzilis
Hmm.
and so forth. They have always been present.
Hmm.
And because it is, as England is such a mongrel country, and
Hmm.
waves upon waves of migrants coming in,
Hmm.
Italy in the middle of the Mediterranean is the same.
Hmm.
And last night, seeing those beautiful faces of
Mhm.
young people, you realize those are part African and so forth.
Mhm.
This is the
Mhm.
genetic makeup of
Mhm. Mhm.
Italy. And
Mhm.
those are, well, some people are rather difficult, like Duke Alessandro de
Mhm.
Medici. He's the Black
Mhm.
Prince. He was cruel
Mhm. Mhm.
against his own people. But
Mhm.
I do see the potential in Italy
Mhm.
for the racism to undo itself.
Mhm. And
There's,
how do you imagine they might do that?
well, I think um, the way we've sort of been doing it, people come into our library and there are these large, beautiful photographs in colour
Mhm.
of Roma with
Mhm.
babies in cradles, happy, and they were taken by my friend who teaches in Alabama. She's a professor of art,
Mhm.
Karen Graffio. Her family is in James Agee's Now Let Us Praise Famous Men.
Mhm.
They were poor sharecroppers.
Mhm.
And so she decided, since he was writing about America's poorest, that she would come to Europe and
Mhm.
photograph Europe's poorest.
Mhm.
And so she and I went into the camps together because she didn't have Italian and I
Mhm.
was translating for her.
Mhm.
And then we went to Romania together to be with the families we knew who were boxing and coxing between Italy and
Mhm.
Romania.
Mhm.
I went to see if the stories were true. Could 12 people sleep in one room with no windows? I
Mhm.
didn't believe it until I
Mhm.
saw it.
Mhm.
And I found that they were telling the truth
Mhm.
about their poverty. And
Mhm.
that, with that, we've worked together intensely on this project of restoration, which is
Mhm.
a showcase of
Mhm.
skills,
Mhm.
and valorizing, and also a sort of mutual dignity.
Mhm.
I'm a bit upset that we've now found that I have to not have them be members of our association if we want to give them work contracts. It's not allowed.
Mhm.
And to
Oh.
me, yes, to me, their membership, I taught them to write their names for the first time, European
Mhm.
citizens,
Mhm.
um,
Mhm.
in the membership book 10 years ago. And now they're
Mhm.
having to sign that they're no longer members because it's going to be more important for them to have work contracts to support their families.
Is this a
So
law or?
if they're members and I'm the president,
Mhm.
the president can't make any money out of an association,
Ah,
not
I
even the
see.
members.
Mhm.
So they can't have work contracts within the association
Right.
unless they're non-members. But
Right.
what we've done, we've created two, your twins. Um,
Mhm.
we created a second, this was partly for European funding, which we didn't get.
Mhm.
We have a second association, which is ROM. And
Mhm.
I'm not a part of it because it's
Mhm.
theirs, but
Mhm.
it's our twin.
Mhm. Mhm.
So they can continue as members of our twin and
Mhm.
they can bring reports to our General Assembly
Right.
and as on an equal standing.
Okay. So that
I
way, at least they can still, but can they still interact with the
We still have the
association?
democracy,
Okay. Okay. Okay.
even though we've had to put a bit of it into a hierarchy, which I don't believe in,
Mhm. Mhm.
where they
Mhm.
are my dependents,
Mhm.
dependenti.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
it's the only way. I talked with the commercialista 2 days ago. It's the
Mhm.
only way we can do it legally.
Mhm.
Otherwise, we would be seen as corrupt.
Right. Right. I understand. Mm.
And
As if you were self-dealing. I understand. I understand.
mhm.
Wow. What a week, huh?
No. But I think a lot of this it's dealing with the ancient concept of the
Mhm.
res commune, the republic, the
Mhm.
people's thing,
Mhm. Mhm.
where we can be inclusive of the people. And this is
Mhm.
our government,
Mhm.
not
Mhm.
theirs, but
Right.
ours
Right. Right. Well,
together.
shall we
I'll
start
start on
shall we
rain.
shall we start our conversation about rain today? Yeah? Okay. So today we're getting to book 6, which is The Blood of Anatole Basile Tejo. I guess I should formally welcome everyone who's watching. I always forget to do these formal things, but I'm also glad that this is a very open-ended kind of endeavor that we've entered into, and we can make of it whatever we wish. I do welcome everyone who's watching or who will be watching later. Thanks for joining us. And Julie and I today are going to be talking about the love canticle. I think um, I think this is a fair description of book 6, The Blood of Anatole Basile Tejo. The summary of the book says how young Nato Tejo learned to love his name and fulfill his father's dream at the French missionary school in Bonthe, how he met and fell in love with his Franco-Norman wife Marie and discovered the poets of négritude, how Anna Adongo found a mirror of her beauty in Doctor Tejo's eyes, how Hehra went traveling to fulfill Mamma Akoth's final wish for her and the family that she discovered in London, how Anna Adongo finally fulfilled her girlhood dream of love. The book, all of book 6, is fairly straightforward compared to some of the other books. I think it's the most linear in its narrative form, right? It centers on two people primarily, on Anatole Basile Tejo and his childhood, and then it centers on Hehra Akoth, and her adulthood, right? And each of them has three cantos dedicated to their story, and the final canto sort of merges, is where you see the convergence of their story generationally. Book 6 also connects, and this, I say all of this as a fellow reader, Julia, because every time I prepare for one of these, I reread the section that we're going to talk about.
Yes.
And I always have the conversation we had together from last week in mind. And something that I noticed, I sound like such an irresponsible author, but something that I noticed um, was the through line from book 5 into book 6 and then into book 7 is carried through by Hera's story, right? Because
Yeah.
book 5, although it's dominated with Maya's dream walk on board the Saint Raphael with Jean de Souza, and with Alex's caring for her, and it takes us into the sort of the details of how her dreams sort of manifest themselves even when she's asleep. It ends with Mamma Akoth reflecting on the naming of Hehra, right? Reflecting on this foreign child who Anna brought home, and reflecting
No
on
one to
how.
name her.
Sorry.
She has no one to name her
She
amongst
has no
the.
one to name her, exactly. And how the naming of Hera, in a sense, marks the break in tradition, right? It's Mama Akoth's most explicit transgression of traditional norms, because she refuses to be complicit in seeing this child neglected, right, by the collective, both the spiritual and the social collective. And so Hera's naming is an act of will that defies tradition, and so sets this child apart in an interesting way. She was already set apart when Esther, her older sister, sort of accidentally happened upon their mother cooing over this baby and loving her in a way
Mhm.
that she had never loved her other children. But now we see that it wasn't just Anna who breaks in her habit, in her attitude toward Hehra. We see also Mamma Akoth break not only in habit but also in tradition with regards to Hehra. And so Hehra's story, as it unfolds, like I said, to me was it's I won't say too much because I'm really interested in hearing what you have to say. But to me, it was really interesting that as um, as it moves through book six, she 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 experiences this arch that seems to take its cue from her father's experience, right? So Hera is this soul that has been loved perfectly by
Mhm.
all, and she moves through the world beloved by everyone. Everyone who meets her loves
Yeah,
her, right?
yeah.
And it is easily reflected in something that's said about Nato Tejo. Nato Tejo has a kind of personality where everyone who meets him loves
Mhm.
him, right? And quite abundantly, quite generously, without condition, right? And yet Hera's story changes out of no fault of her own,
Mhm.
that this fairy tale,
Yeah,
um, nature or circumstance or what have you, does not participate in the sort of the opera of Hera's happiness, right? Um, the circumstances drive, I think, deep trauma into her life, and then she becomes a mimic of Mama Koth when she stuffs away the trauma and decides to be a mother, right? To focus on being a mother. It's really interesting. I can spoil this for you a little bit or preview it for you a little bit. As I'm writing Wind, the one that focuses on Esther, the consequences of Hera doing that, when she makes the decision either grieve or nurture her babies, right? And she chooses to shut down the grief and instead focus on nurturing the babies, the consequences of that begin to unfurl in the second book, in Wind, right? In the second volume of the Dreamwalker Canticles. Um, and as I write it, I find myself just, sometimes it takes my breath away, thinking, oh gosh, this is what it feels like to live in this world that is so full of joy and blessing, but that can also be so unforgiving, right? So, to conclude my summary, um, the way I saw the through line into book seven was that Hera's experience of love and discovery of family all happened in the setting of a place that is overflowing with stone representations of European um, glory, history, conquest. You know, she's not thinking about it in that way. She's just, going through these stone forests and looking at these stone effigies of past princes and kings and saints, and just experiencing them firsthand, like marveling at the fact that Isaac Newton is buried at Westminster, and things like that, and really connecting with the Black Prince's lamentation. But it's only in book seven that the stone gets stripped away, right? The sort of the glorified stone history is reduced to flesh and to dust, because of the lived violence that all of those emblems, all of those monuments entail. And and it's so fascinating because Alex, who was in book 5, only then comes back later in book 7 when we're reflecting on his understanding of history, right? His archival understanding of history, and how Alex can't hear the echoes of the pain and the anguish between the lines of history books. This same Alex, who is deeply generous and empathic and mindful of his sister's well-being, is nevertheless blind to the things and the pains that the lived experience brings with it. And so I know that was my last word on the summary. I want to now segue into the first paragraph of Canto 36. And before I do that, just make a note, something that Mary, who did a review of Rain, pointed out. She was tickled. She found the description of how Anatole's father calls him, the fact that he bellows in dactylic tetrameter. She found that so amusing, and in retrospect, I did too. It is a very strange experience to be a reader of something you've written, right? Because
Yes.
it sounds different. And so before I read the first paragraph, let me, so that it's not too long a read, I want to read just up to that point and then go back to the first paragraph, because because referring back to our conversation about like channeling or being a scribe, transcribing what you hear. This, I think, is a great example of, after the fact, me discovering something in the text that I did not consciously, purposely put there. Okay, so this is what it is. It's I think this is in the third paragraph. It begins. Well, other than his teach, actually, you know what? It makes sense if I read the first paragraph, then the third paragraph, because otherwise it'll just be a mishmash. Then I'll double back. Here we go. Canto 36. 9-year-old Nato did not like his name. It sounded like an old-fashioned dandy's name, of the sort who walked around in waistcoats and top hats and monocles, a pocket watch tucked away at the end of a silver fob, a walking stick in one hand, and a cigar in the other. At least that is what he envisioned whenever the English teacher in primary school called him when taking attendance. Anatole Basile Tejo! Present, he would respond, cringing a little, the snickers from the row behind him just loud enough to let him know that his classmates, too, found the name a bit absurd. So I'll skip the next paragraph, which elaborates the kind of name he would have liked to have gotten, and then enter this one. Other than his teacher, nobody really called him Anatole, or Basile, for that matter. In that case, in case it was English, it would be Anatole or Basil, right? Anatole or Basil, right? Anyway, for that matter. At home and in the playground, he was always simply Nato. People generally said something closer to Natu, and he knew he was in trouble when he heard his mother's voice from across the village homestead calling out, Nadu! Only his father, the man who had chosen that embarrassing name, used it with any regularity. Anatole, he would say, his voice profound with pride and affection, you must, following up with some morsel of paternal counsel. Where his mother trilled, Nadu, when he was in trouble, his father bellowed in dactylic tetrameter, the duality of the second and third name making them sound trocade. Anatole Basile Tejo! Curiously, perhaps because of the music in their heralds' voices, these calls to discipline did not have the effect of alarming the boy. Instead, he would run to his mother when she hollered, or to his father when he bellowed, and stand stock straight at attention, waiting to find out what he had done to merit such an imperious summons. And that very response, prompt and dauntless, perhaps even valiant, tickled the summoner's poorly hidden mirth, making it common for Nato to meet with shining, indulgent eyes rather than angry or impatient glares. And the part of this paragraph that I wanted to just zero in on and then pass the mic to you was his father bellowed in dactylic tetrameter, the duality of the second and third names making them sound trochaic, Anatole Basile Tejo. Now, what I noticed upon rereading was this: dun 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 dun, right? Or dun 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 dun. The first sentence of the book is 9-year-old Nato did not like his name. So it comes out in trochaic tetrameter as well. Bum 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 bum. It sounded like, and then the rest sort of flows into natural things. So in a coda to last week's discussion about sort of like poetic channeling, for lack of a better word, I find it so fascinating given Anatole or Nato and then Anatole's life has imbued as he is in literature and poetry and the musicality
Yes.
of it. And as poetic as his own voice is, even the story about him comes out like that,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
It ends up having these rhythmic characteristics. And this is not the only place it happens. It consistently happens throughout this book. And so I just wanted to start well on that note because this is a love canticle. And with that, I will pass the mic on to you, my dear Julia.
It's difficult. I found this part really interesting. It's because you have it in three. You have
Mm-hmm.
Anatole's education, and
Mm-hmm.
then you have um, Anna and the consummation with Anatole, and then
Mm-hmm.
you have Hehra and the consummation with Solomon.
Mm-hmm.
So it is a triad,
Mm-hmm.
and I found the character of Anatole fascinating. He's
Mm-hmm.
both positive and negative.
Mm-hmm.
He learns how to assume his name after having rejected it,
Mm-hmm.
and he becomes very francophone. And I found that part fascinating
Mm-hmm.
because you and I have had the privileges of entering into other cultures and
Mm-hmm.
languages.
Mm-hmm.
So, in England, we had this system of the child in the English family going to stay with the French family, and the child in the French family going to stay with the English in
Mm-hmm.
the au pair. And I loved my two, because our English Easter vacations are a month long,
Mm-hmm.
staying with a family in Paris and also in the countryside
Mm-hmm.
and devouring the books on their bookshelf and
Mm-hmm.
becoming fluent in French.
Mm-hmm.
Assuming French culture to the point
Mm-hmm.
when I arrived in America and I was talking with my hands,
Mm-hmm.
the children of Italian immigrants were pushing my hands down by my side and saying, "We don't do this."
Ooh, wow. Talk about
I know.
cultural
I was lost
self-rejection.
because I was so used to, talking with my hands, which is
Mm-hmm.
more Mediterranean than
Mm-hmm.
Anglo-Saxon.
Mm-hmm.
But there you have Anatole devouring books. And I was doing this in convent school. The
Mm-hmm.
books were piling up under my bed,
Mm-hmm.
raising mattress and so on. So I was really identifying with him and so
Uh-huh.
forth. But when I got annoyed with him, it was
Mm-hmm.
when it begins the capital letters,
Mm-hmm.
the African man, the African woman.
Mm-hmm.
Something is not quite right there. And
Mm-hmm.
that's what Anna falls for.
Mm-hmm.
And s- that's where you get the problem in Gabriel's marriage.
Mm-hmm.
And it is a sin to have broken the. I mean, I get very angry in the academic world when a professor, getting a bit old, abandons his wife for a student who looks like his wife when she was younger.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Um, it's not correct. It,
Mm-hmm.
it causes so much hurt,
Mm-hmm.
and it's causing hurt here. But Anatole is so so splendid, so elegant,
Mm-hmm.
so and I can remember coming back on the boat from France to England
Mm-hmm.
when I was about, I think, 14.
Mm-hmm.
And there was an African couple, absolutely elegantly dressed.
Mm-hmm.
She in the most beautiful tailored grey wool suit.
Mm-hmm.
It was so elegant, and
Mm-hmm.
and this when I sort of see that image with Anatole, and then
Mm-hmm.
he's married to the very aristocratic
Mm-hmm.
uh, Normandy,
Mm-hmm.
uh, noblewoman, and so forth. It's charming,
Mm-hmm.
except there's a kind of fly in the ointment. Am I
Mm-hmm.
right in saying
Mm-hmm.
that?
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's a kind of nationalism which, in a sense, disturbs the humanity
Mm-hmm.
of
Mm-hmm.
the bonding between husband and wife and
Mm-hmm.
family.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's a bit, forgive me for saying that.
No,
And then
please.
we have the ritual where
Mm-hmm.
she comes with the small cloth and the
Mm-hmm.
water,
Mm-hmm.
which gets repeated with Hehra.
Mm-hmm.
And with Hehra, it's right. But why these wonderful Jewish names
Mm-hmm.
in the family that Hera meets? And I
Mm-hmm.
love her showing up at the station with all of the books. And, that's marvelous. And I sort of think of you as having traveled around Europe like that. And certainly I did. And, and but the the names Rebecca,
Mm-hmm.
Aaron, Solomon,
Mm-hmm.
those are all Jewish names.
Mm-hmm.
And in a sense, Solomon's family seems both African and Jewish.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Am I right in that?
Please expound what you mean by that.
Well, all of those names are so
Mm-hmm.
biblical
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
that you get the sense of walking into a very Jewish household.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
it's the warmth of a Jewish household is
Mm-hmm.
there. The
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
once the so and she comes back after Solomon's death
Mm-hmm.
to that household,
Mm-hmm.
and there she is buying the piano
Mm-hmm.
and playing the music so that the twins within her
Mm-hmm.
will have the music.
Mm-hmm.
And no, this book is very moving. The story, though, is so sad
Mm-hmm.
about um, the loss of Solomon for
Mm-hmm.
her
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
because of his generosity, his
Mm-hmm.
kindness.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. His gentleness. It's just
Yes, yes.
I I I'm with you 100%, and I'm so grateful for the question. I'm so grateful for the question that you asked about their names, right? That their names are so very biblical. If you look at most of the Christian names,
Yes.
right,
Mhm.
even of the immediate family, these
Mhm.
are all biblical names with very few exceptions. Let me see if I can find.
Mhm.
So,
Yes.
among the biblical names, we have Gabriel,
Hmm.
we have Ruth,
Hmm.
Anna,
Yes.
Rachel,
Hmm.
Sarah,
Yes.
David, and
Hmm.
Esther,
Yes.
right?
Yes. Hmm.
The only ones who don't have biblical names, at least
Alex.
that I know of, Alexander, exactly,
Hmm.
Maya, and
Hmm.
Hera, right?
Right. Right. Hmm.
And from a historical perspective, I'll answer your question from both a historical as well as a like historical cultural as well as a like a literary poetic, right? Because
Hmm.
I think it's a wonderful question. From a historical cultural, these names, these adopted names, especially if you look at the, I'm gonna hold this up to the thing. When you look
Yes,
at the
yes.
the
Mhm.
the family timeline, you notice that they only begin to appear in the later generations,
Right,
right?
right. With the assimilation to white culture.
Exactly. And this is with the advent of sort of Christian missionaries and
Yes.
the sort of the assimilation, adoption, normalization of Christianity. We know that by Mamma Akoth's girlhood, she's already getting educated in a missionary school. That's where
Yeah.
she got her leather Bible, right? Mamma Akoth is a deeply devout Christian, right? She knows her Bible left and right. She writes prayers and
Yes.
annotations in it.
Mhm.
Um, and even when she gives Esther the letters, the sort of the treasure box of letters from her deceased grandson,
Yes.
she takes the Bible that she always keeps with them. She keeps that, but she
Mhm.
gives Esther the rest of it. She travels with her Bible everywhere,
Yes.
and when she hears echoes of Portuguese scripture coming
Mhm.
from Maya's dream walks, she
Mhm.
recognizes them, even though she doesn't know Portuguese, right? And she recognizes which verses they are, right? She recognizes the Corinthians, for example, she recognizes that. So that throughout the story, there's been sort of breadcrumbs of
Mhm.
the presence or introduction of Christian indoctrination. I think that's the only word I can use that is
Mhm.
will do
Mhm.
it justice.
Mhm.
Starting
Mhm.
from the theological debate, right, that Alex and Maya had,
Mhm.
where in Maya's mind, we had her sort of revisiting all these biblical phrases, especially from the Ten Commandments and God's declaration of his sovereignty. But in her child's mind's memory, the text is all jumbled, right? And they end up
Yes.
saying things that don't really make a lot of sense, right? Well, for example, in reciting the Nicene Creed, they say rather than he was incarnate uh, and through the Virgin Mary, they think things like he came in a car and ate with the Virgin Mary or something like that. You know
Yes.
what I mean? Because that's what
Right.
makes that's what makes sense to them. And when they say God, the giver of life, etc., because it's God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit, their 5-year-old minds
Mhm.
have God the Father, but then God the Son in the sky, right?
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
God the Holy Spirit. So they translate God the giver of life into
Mhm.
God the giver of light, right?
Yes.
So
Mhm.
that the Son then makes sense, you know? And then everything else. So it's interesting how the innocence of the children, right? And the I guess the flexibility of their minds just sort of mold these indoctrinating words into the story that makes most sense to them at that moment, and then it becomes, they internalize it and becomes just part of their culture. It never occurs to them to question it, right? To interrogate it. And this is one of the most effective things about the missionary project, right?
Mhm.
Especially of colonialism, to
Mhm.
present all this indoctrination as inevitable and
Mhm.
necessary, and to get the people to internalize it to the point where they become the defenders of the instrument of their own indoctrination.
Right.
And
Right. Yes.
exactly. And so, and this is not to question people's faith. No, my purpose is not at all to question people's faith. Just to explore some of the mechanisms by
Yes.
which an instrument of colonialism sort of
Mhm.
seeps into the blood
Mhm.
and ends up being owned by the very people that this instrument is being used to violate and oppress and exploit.
Right. Mhm.
So going back to excuse me, going back to the names of these families. So with that generation introduction of Christian indoctrination, and in the case of a country like Kenya, it's primarily Anglican, right? There's some small percentage of Catholicism, um, but because it's primarily Anglican through British colonization, it nevertheless also means, I think missionaries tend to have a much more synthesized and maybe essentialist version of the scripture than one would get in their own home. And so part of being baptized in this tradition means adopting a Christian name. That's why they say my Christian name is, right?
Right.
Um,
Yes.
adopting a British or English or whatever. And the place to go that has the cultural and
The two
moral
worlds. Yes.
authority is the
Hmm.
Bible, right?
Yes.
And this plays very much into the significance of naming, like
Hmm.
in this entire book, because so much is driven not just by the names people hold, but the very process of naming as the way
Hmm.
one is brought into and accepted as a member
Yes.
of their community.
Hmm.
So this is where the history of these names are coming from and why they're also biblical, or how it is that they come to be so
Right.
biblical.
Right.
Now,
Hmm.
granted, it's there's not a rule or a law that it has to be biblical, because there are many names with examples like Alexander and Hehra and Maya that are not biblical, but nevertheless are categorized in the this is my Christian name category, because that's a new adaptation. Now, from the literary, poetic side, the names of this family, Aaron, Rebecca, Solomon, and Jonathan, right?
Yes.
Um, they the I'm so it warms my heart to hear you first notice that they sound very Jewish, and so it creates the sense that this is a Jewish home that she's coming into. And the way I read it before I heard you say that, and the way I read it even as a scribe before I heard you say that, was that these old-fashioned Old Testament names
Hmm.
bespoke a deeply rooted tradition, right?
Yes.
And in a sense encoded that deep rootedness in a
Hmm.
way that is essentially universally understood, right?
Yes.
So
Hmm.
these are not people without roots, without culture. They do have deep roots and deep culture, and the kinds of names they bear bespeak this. And now, in their own world, in the world of Lake Victoria, the name of this family is Ogot. Among the Luo people, the Ogot family is one of, it's actually today, and again, this is one of those things that happen subconsciously, and then after the fact, you realize it's one of the most deeply rooted, historically respected families, even today, right?
Mm. Yes.
Many intellectuals and even leaders come from this
Hmm.
family. And one of the most, I think there are two really important writers from the 60s are of the Ogot family, or they bear the name Ogot, right? So there's Professor Ogot and there's Bethwell Ogot. In fact, if you look up Bethwell Ogot on Amazon, you could probably buy her books. And there are books that recount these stories. Secondly, you notice that they are of a particular clan, the clan of Jokowin, right?
Yes.
The family at the center, Maya's family, is the family of Jokomolo and Jokolo, right? And uh, Jokolo, I know this I know was a fictitious one, but I also know that the Jokomolo clan is quite prominent in southern Lake Victoria. Jokowin, however, in the history of the Luo people, they're the original clan that came from the river. Like they're essentially they're the first people, right, among the Luo people. And so this clan is the most deeply rooted among all of the different
Hmm.
subgroups that make up the Luo ethnic group of people who speak this language and come from different areas or belong to different clans. And these clans recognize one another's histories and depth of root and what
Yes.
have you.
Mhm.
And if you were to read a history book about the Luo people, the principal clan that would be named for you as like the founding clan of the people is the clan of Jokowin. So Solomon comes from a family that has deep roots in the land where he's from. Poetically, that gets communicated when you see that he comes from a family whose names communicate
Mhm.
this age and depth of cultural
Yes.
roots, right?
Which makes Hera the Queen of Sheba.
Yes,
Mm.
yes, yes. In fact, I
Yeah.
in fact I remember starting a little bit, right? Being a little bit startled when I was writing book 7.
Yeah.
And actually, it might be worth reading because I think if I summarize it, I'll do it in justice. But I was writing book 7, and this came out, and I thought, oh my God, in talking about the European, the post
Mhm.
scramble for Africa dynamics of colonialism, right?
Mhm.
We go through basically, you know how epic poems go through like catalogs of ships and what have
Yes.
you. This
Yes.
one goes through a catalog of conquerors, right? Catalogs of
Mhm.
colonizers.
Right. Right.
and
Yes. Mhm.
and this is the paragraph that's dedicated to the Italians' contribution, right?
Mhm.
It goes
Mhm.
like this: Sons of Italia, brava gente, make their entrance into the game, Abyssinia their singular aim. How better to raise the old glory of Rome than to conquer the land of the Queen of Sheba, the land of the children of Solomon? But the warring sons of Italia cannot make Abyssinia submit. So instead, they engage in chattel trade with the fathers of daughters, of babies not yet maidens. And these children, the sons of Italia, are confined to their harems for service both carnal and menial, gifting and trading these girls as they please, because after all, that is how it is done. Caesar and Mark Antony both took pleasure in Queen Cleopatra's bed, these sons of Italia, the infant daughters of Abyssinia instead. And so it was a moment when later when I was writing and I get come to this line, how better to raise the old glory of Rome than to conquer the land of the Queen of Sheba, the land of the children of Solomon. I thought, oh my God, the poor children of
Yes.
Solomon.
Yes. 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 And
you
I
know?
began by talking about the general's daughter
Yes,
at this reception in
yes,
Rome,
yes, yes, yes.
which is part of that pattern.
Mhm, mhm,
Um,
mhm, mhm,
because the Italians, at least, yes, things were wrong, but they did raise illegitimate children
mhm, mhm,
in their families,
mhm,
like Leonardo da Vinci. And so
mhm,
there was this sense that your progeny
mhm,
deserves to be sustained,
mhm,
along with the idea of no capital punishment and so
mhm,
forth. There's a
mhm,
very deeply rooted
mhm,
in Italian culture.
mhm,
At the same time, there is also this wrongness
mhm,
of, I mean, the attempt to conquer Ethiopia,
mhm,
Abyssinia,
mhm, mhm,
with the
mhm,
tribesmen on their horses with
mhm,
javelins against the
mhm,
airplanes was
mhm, mhm,
so lopsided and wrong.
mhm.
And,
And yet, nevertheless, Abyssinia persisted, you know?
mhm,
It was the courage that drove them much more than the machines that they had at their disposal to
mhm,
resist
mhm,
the Italians. But
mhm.
let's bring it back to book 6
Yes.
because now we're
Mhm,
beginning to anticipate elements of book 7, and we might
mhm,
exhaust that conversation before we get to it. Um, so the question that you ask about the names, I think is a beautiful and profound one because it allows us to then bring these things to light
mhm,
and I will once again I will continue to confess that as a storyteller, as a scribe, right, as the person bringing sort of the technical skill to realize or to materialize, right, the book of the story that I'm hearing, I'm I bring to bear my knowledge and understanding of history, certainly. But then as a reader, I'm still always
Yes.
surprised by the story I'm hearing, you know?
Mhm.
And it strikes me as I when I gosh, it's happening already. I told myself that I wouldn't talk so much about Dante, but I have to in this particular point. When I think about when I think about the way Dante writes, right? The way his poetry flows in the Commedia, right? Um, and the way even the way he can sustain a discourse across tens of thousands of verse, or let me say thousands because there are only 14,000, right? But across thousands of verse, sustain a discourse by reigniting your memory that, ah, yes, we talked about this once before. And then a little while later, again, reigniting your memory again and sustaining that, but always in a progressive way. Like it's not a static coming back to the
Mhm.
original
Mhm.
point, but rather building on what happened
Yes.
before. When I think about the way that itself contributes to the sense of unity and also the forward momentum of the poetry's flowing,
Mhm. Mhm.
I realized that one of the things that always fascinated me was the question of how conscious is he that he's doing
Mhm.
this, right? Like how
Mhm.
intentional is his how intentional is it that he's managing to create this seamless flow? But then I stop myself and I say, what's on the page is what he put there, right? And having studied music and been educated in the art of composition, of musical composition, I'm also
Yes.
aware of the fact that one can't just like jam elements together and make something that feels organic. So
Mhm.
there's something about composition, poetic,
Right. Mhm.
literary, and musical composition
Yes.
that
Mhm.
really escapes quantification, that is
Yes.
ineffable, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Um,
It's right brain, not left brain. It's not
yes.
linear. It
Mm-hmm,
has this well in liturgy,
mm-hmm,
uh you do the chiasmus, the
mm-hmm,
A B C B A.
mm-hmm,
You're dealing with different patterns than
mm-hmm,
the sort of logical, realistic
mm-hmm,
world is
mm-hmm,
comfortable with. Um,
mm-hmm,
and, and I'd like to go back a bit.
mm-hmm,
You are talking about the assimilation of Judeo Christianity
mm-hmm,
in Africa. But of
mm-hmm,
course, this also happened to the Anglo Saxons, indeed.
mm-hmm,
Uh, we were a pagan nation,
mm-hmm,
and Augustine is sent by Pope Gregory
mm-hmm,
to convert the
mm-hmm,
pagans. So
mm-hmm,
you get in Bede's account of the
mm-hmm,
English church and people, you get
mm-hmm,
this account of the two cultures
mm-hmm,
clashing and so forth.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
Um, in Dante,
mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm just finishing, we're still reading the cantos, and you have suddenly in Paradiso the birth of twins to Latona,
Mhm.
which I immediately thought of all of your twins in Rain.
Uh-huh.
But Dante is playing this game of the pagan world and the
Mhm.
Christian world
Mhm.
side by side.
Mhm. Mhm.
He is the humanist,
Mhm.
and he's not giving up.
Mhm.
The Etruscan culture is lost, but not the Roman culture,
Mhm.
and he's giving them equal time.
Mhm.
He's not destroying his own nation's identity,
Mhm.
but celebrating both,
Mhm.
if that makes sense.
No, it does make sense, actually. It does make sense.
twins.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like Alex Alex is not very African, is he?
Here's what's really interesting about Alex is that I think we talked about this before. The way his understanding of the world is almost entirely informed by the information that he absorbs from books.
Yes. Hmm.
That and his empathy with Maya, right?
Right.
And what he goes around hearing other people say. There's a time where
Yes.
when he was younger, he'd go out and listen to what his siblings learned at school so that he could come back and tell his baby sister. And he spends all this time at the library, and he's very literal, right, in his
Yes. Hmm.
absorption of these. He doesn't
Yeah,
have
left
any,
brain.
yeah, he doesn't have any critical filters or
Mm-hmm.
anything like that. And so, and he doesn't have any experiential filters,
Hmm.
right? Not experiential filters in the world of time, as it were. Um, um, so, 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 yeah, when you say he's not very African, here's what's really interesting, though. He is, in the sense that he embodies, oh my gosh, this. Can you give me just one moment? I need to
Yes.
plug the computer in because the battery light just went bling.
Okay, right, right.
It'll give me 10 seconds. I just need to grab it
Yes,
over there,
yes.
put it in here, and plug it in. I'll be right back. Hold on a second.
Okay.
Okay. So, so that and oh, ooh, how do we do this?
That's what I was doing yesterday. I barely managed to get the film going
Hold on a
at
second.
the
I
right
don't know if I
time.
hear you.
Everything
I
went
don't have
wrong
my,
and then
my
everything
headphones
went
on.
right.
But in just a minute,
Mhm.
and I'll be all set. Yes.
Good. I was surprised,
Okay.
shocked when I came across the line where you said
I'm sorry,
that
Julie.
Maya.
Julie,
Okay,
I'm
I
sorry.
was shocked when you said that Maya. You talked about Maya's affliction
Uh-huh.
because I don't think it's an affliction.
Hmm.
I love the way her mind works.
Yes, yes,
Um, but I do sort of see perhaps she's functioning a bit like an autistic child.
yes, yes. And I think it's important to note that it's others who call her that, right?
Right.
It's
Hmm.
through the mind of, say, Esther, who
Yes.
talks about her afflicted kin. And
Hmm.
it's very possible that Esther's own language is informed by these sort of normalizing
Hmm.
frames that people adopt and
Hmm.
internalize, right?
Yes.
Because
Yes.
if one were to describe Maya clinically, someone
Hmm.
would come up with a diagnosis. Oh, well, she's obviously divergent, right? She's obviously neurodivergent,
Hmm.
right? And in a normative world, a neurodivergent anything
It's not
is
accepted. Hmm.
or pathologized in some way, right? The for me, what makes Esther's use of the term, or at least her mental use of the term afflicted,
Hmm.
um, sort of acceptable, I guess, right? Or I mean, like I accept it from her. Let me put it this way: is
Right.
because her memory of the experience includes their trauma, their suffering, the
Hmm.
fact that with these tendencies, like with Olo and with other dream walkers that they've known, there's a physical toll on them,
Yes.
you
Hmm.
know. But you're absolutely right in that Maya's neurodivergence can be described even in terms of autism or schizophrenia even. I mean, there's so many ways, you know,
Hmm.
to but here's the thing, the story itself does not ever touch that. It does not ever suggest
Hmm.
any kind of categorization of that nature because it's not operating in a normative frame.
And it's the richness. of the story that comes through my
Yeah,
yes.
exactly.
Mhm.
From that very neurodivergence, we get this experience that we would not otherwise have, right?
Mhm.
Because if this story were told, if Maya only saw the world in the sort of,
Sorry,
sorry,
I had to answer the gate door.
oh, sure, no problem. Okay, so fix problems. Hmm. Oh, gosh, this is so. There we go.
Sì, ok. E mi scusi perché sono su Zoom, allora c'è questa. Ah, no, va bene, Giulia. Giovanni è a casa? Sì. You're now? You're now?
Okay.
Come on in. Vieni. Sì. Sorry,
It's
we're
okay.
having to,
It's all right.
we're having to get the equipment, the audio equipment, and it's a huge, big
Uh-huh.
piece of equipment that, and the whole this house is sort of rigged up with the wire to this computer
Uh-huh.
in the way.
Uh-huh. No, it
Okay.
was fun to hear you guys talking to each other and sort of like
Yes,
knowing what you're talking about.
it was
It's
because you guys
cool.
were speaking Italian.
No, bellissimo. Bellissimo.
There's parts of my brain that I have to sort of switch into to
Uh-huh.
switch it.
What I wanted to say about Alex, right? You said Alex is not very African, right? And I think I mentioned that in some ways he is, in that he represents the African who is absorbed in um, who wholeheartedly adopts the sort of Euro, Euro Eurocentrically informed idea about history of the world, about what is important, about what matters. Now,
Yeah,
Alex does it without malice and without um, he doesn't. It's not a. It's yeah. There is no malice or forethought. There's no mens rea. There's no intention to even benefit from it. This just happens to be what his experience is like. This is how he's been educated. And it's something that I think is quite pervasive
hmm,
in Africans even today. You see it when people internalize it and really adopt it, you end up with a lot of young people who can't even speak their mother tongue anymore, right? Because it's not cool to
hmm,
speak the language of the countryside.
hmm,
It's
hmm.
much cooler to speak English flawlessly, maybe even with a British accent, right?
Right,
Or to
right.
speak German perfectly, or to speak Chinese perfectly. These are the languages that are most prevalently taught in
Yeah,
Kenya, and Kenyans go abroad to study, and then to go off and live in Switzerland or Germany or England somewhere, basically to become European, which allows me then to
right.
segue into the story of Anatole Basile Tejo, right?
Yes, yes. Which is where
He-
you also sort of sense something is not quite right.
yes, yes,
And
because as beautifully and
mhm,
as enchanting as this story and this figure is, right? As charming. Um,
ciao, grazie, mille grazie per ieri. Okay.
I'll wait. I'll wait. It's okay. Are they done?
Yes.
Okay.
They're the ones that made it possible to do the sound last
Mhm, That's
night.
that's fantastic.
And, I was fascinated by my mother told me
Hmm.
about how when Nero was in prison, he
Hmm.
wrote the history of the world for his daughter Indira.
Hmm.
I always wanted to get my hands on a copy of this.
Hmm. Hmm.
And finally, I was Giovanni Gentile, who was descended from Giovanni Gentile, Mussolini's theoretician.
Mhm.
publish my edition of Il Tesoretto and paid me 1,000,000 lira. So I was able to go
Mhm.
to Iceland. And
Mhm.
I was staying in the house of an Icelandic scholar. And
Mhm.
in the corridor were these wonderful shelves of books that I
Mhm.
found there. Indira, Neru's book written for his daughter, Indira. And I
Mhm.
was sitting on the floor reading it.
Mhm.
And in it, I come across Nero talking about Giovanni Gentile.
Mhm.
And I was seeing this other perspective
Mhm.
of world history,
Mhm.
not our propaganda of
Mhm.
anti-fascism,
Mhm.
but instead this other side.
Mhm.
And later on, I did acquire from the family the
Mhm.
writings of Giovanni Gentile. He
Mhm.
was an extraordinarily brilliant philosopher
Mhm.
and pedagogue, and really concerned about excellence in Italian education.
Mhm.
So, you know, these different perspectives.
Mhm. Mhm.
I think it's terribly important to actually be able to go and see the other side. It's
Mhm.
why quite often I listen to Al Jazeera,
Mhm.
get
Mhm. Mhm.
the other side of the story.
Mhm.
Find that the other side of the story is often compassionate,
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
where when we have been indoctrinated into
Mhm.
it as negative and evil.
And this is where for me the story of Anatole Basile becomes very interesting, right? The Frenchification, right? Or the
Yes,
Francophonification of Anatole
and
Basile.
then the Africanization, which is Europeanized.
Right, no, exactly. Because no, but here's the thing. Here's the thing. He starts out in sort of in neutral, right? There's nothing that is particularly identifiable as an African boy about him, except for the fact that he wishes he had an African name, right?
Yes,
He wishes his name were not this, Franco-Hellenic Anatole Basile, because it's so unusual. And it's not because of the cultural significance per se, like, writ large in terms of like abstract notions,
yes.
but rather because the cultural norm around him
Mhm.
um, comes with certain heroes, known names, heroes whose names are Bai and Saidu and Amadou, right? These are the names of the great figures, the admiral figures, the heroes that the kids want to emulate. And he has this just bizarre, out of the blue name that nobody, likes because it's just too strange anyway. And we know that this is a name that he got from his father. So the idea is this young boy who is essentially starting as a tabula rasa, and he has placed upon him already the legacy of colonization by his father, right? Without it being problematized in any way, right? Without it being any kind of polemic. Um, and the polemic never ever develops because the experience that he's immersed in that actually feeds his natural inclination for poetry and things of beauty of
Yeah.
every kind happens to be the francophone experience, which again is also orchestrated by his father, right? Because his father is the one who has laid this path out for him, because his father is the one who has completely internalized the idea, which is a very French idea, that the epitome of culture and civilization is to become a Frenchman, right? And what's really interesting about the distinction between French colonizers and the British
Mhm.
colonizers was one of the most interesting divergences, that for the French, their colonies were almost like an extension of the French
Right.
people out into the world, whereas for
Yes.
the British, it was more about siphoning resources
Right.
and
Right.
getting to live their fantasy as, the king in his castle type of thing, right?
Mhm. mhm.
So this is why the little discourse about the distinction between the French and the British schools are totally utilitarian, right? Just to make the local population useful to the colonizers, whereas the French missionary schools, especially the elite ones, the ones that are run by this private
Right,
elite French
fathers.
missionary school that's run by an aristocratic family, right? And therefore can be sustained, but nonetheless promotes this French ideal of French supremacy, right?
Yes. Mhm.
So Anatole or Nato, I guess, Nato is then placed in this context, and being a young child who wants to please his father, for no other reason than he adores his father. His father
Yes.
is his hero. His father even has the best possible name in the world, Tejo, right? Which is full of history, that is full of like heroic resonance. And this is a man who loves him and adores him completely, right? So that the description, for example, of Nato never encountering a harsh word or a harsh look from anyone
Right.
is
Mhm.
important because he comes out of the world where he's loved
Yes.
perfectly. He
And
is a
even the African form of his name, Nato, means
mhm.
he's the one who is born.
Yes, yes.
It's sort of the incarnation.
Exactly. And so what's really interesting to me is right before we enter into the process of um his indoctrination into becoming
Mm,
French,
yes.
if you remember, there's a, a long moment that describes two recurring dreams, right? The
Right.
dream,
The
the
nightmares.
dream,
Yes. Mhm.
exactly. There's a dream of falling, right?
Yes.
Which
Mhm.
reveals itself to actually be a prescient dream because
Right.
it parallels actual events in Paris. He doesn't
Mhm.
know where he is. He's a young boy, and all he sees is himself as a man. And sometimes he experiences the fall. Sometimes it's violent. Sometimes it's slow. But the news that he never gets, but that we as readers get to know, is that these dreams stop when the suicides in Paris stop, right?
Mhm.
The other dream that he has that recurs and keeps coming back time and time and time again is that of the elephant that comes into the village
Mhm.
and is always like he it's not about them avoiding or seeking one another, but they're always face to face, right? And it's a young cow elephant, and when he's not in front of her, she's dissatisfied. Like you can see that she's seeking him, and he's always inevitably in front of her as well. And when he wakes up, it's because of the pressure of the elephant on him that leaves him breathless. And I will confess this, when I'm writing these dreams, as a writer, I'm thinking, you know, uh, I suspect that Nato has these tendencies, these dreamwalker tendencies, because
Yes.
he has these
Mhm.
prescient dreams, but I don't know how that's going to develop. Now,
Mhm.
at the time I was writing that, I didn't have a clear idea of what it would reveal in the end. It turns out that after this, then he becomes Frenchified, and there's never really much talk of any more dreams, except for the earlier note that years later the dream of the elephant recurs. Now in book 6, we actually see the dream of the elephant materialize
Mhm.
when, if you remember, when Hera gives birth and all the women are standing around,
Mhm.
Mamma Akoth thinks when an elephant births, all the other cows in the herd stand
Yes.
around until
Yes.
the baby can stand on its own, right? And elephants are incredibly strict, like they're very reliably socialized animals, right? They have very, very reliably traceable rituals, and some of those
Yes.
rituals include the way they behave when one of the
Mhm.
cows, because the female elephants who tend to move in herds. The male ones tend to sometimes they'll gather together, but they tend to travel, in smaller groups or individually. Anyway, when a cow is about to give birth, they do rally around her. They create a circle around her, and they will stand like that for hours, hours, tens of hours if necessary, during the birth, after the birth, until the baby is able to stand up, and then they can all move along together. So the wall that they create around the mother keeps any danger at bay. Also, when they're all mobile and they have babies amongst them, any of them detects danger, and the cows automatically form a ring around the babies, all of them looking outward. It's the most magical thing I've ever seen. You know what? I'll send you a video of it. It's really quite remarkable. They detect danger and boom, rapid response. All the babies are corralled and kept safe. And so when Mamma Akoth has this idea, when an elephant gives birth, she's looking at Maya and Esther and Rebecca and Maana, right? And Ma Ruth and herself standing outside the nursery while Hehra, meets the infants for the first time. This idea of these mothers as the elephant, it comes back, at least it resonates back to Anatole's dream. Because when Anna comes to him, there's this young elephant who must have him, right? But this is not the only time she does that. 9 years later, or 10 years later, whenever it is, he goes and searches for him around the world.
Right.
Because she has to have what she wants to get from him, right? And each time he's left kind of breathless by it, right? And so for me, what's really interesting about this element of Nato's boyhood, which happens, we hear about it in his, he enters boarding school when he's 10 years old. And so these are the last vestiges of these tendencies before he becomes Frenchified, right? And then it's only later that you realize that he's actually the descendant of a dream walker. You see what I mean? So he has all of these he has this genetic predisposition to dream walking. He's not a dream walker himself, because we've seen in the Jokolo that they're not every generation is a dream walker. They're all different kinds of things. But he has his predisposition, and because it's genetic, it can be passed on. Hehra obviously doesn't have it. But what about her children?
Yes.
Right?
I'm really curious as to what's going to be happening with the twins.
I know, right? Yeah. So these are the things that, again, as a fellow reader, I'm like, wow, that's really kind of cool. you know, I have. I'm sorry. Go on. Go on.
No, it's a splendid book.
Oh,
And
can I tell
I
you?
I actually I wrote an email, but they wouldn't have got it in time, to
Mhm,
Dennis Looney and to Malcolm Quitey
mhm, mhm.
with how to get into this.
Ah,
So
okay, okay.
and
Oh,
so
yes,
if they ever do try, do let them in,
yes,
uh,
absolutely. I will. I will.
because
Now, just know that every week the link is going to be different because of the way this program works. But I will try and make sure that I send you the link earlier and earlier every week, because I think I've been sending them on Friday afternoons. But maybe since I can set them up early, I'll send you the next one.
Friday afternoons, right? We're doing the films until the weather makes it impossible to sit outdoors.
Oh, no, 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 no. I'm not saying that we
Okay,
should do these. I'm saying that the email that I usually send you
okay, right.
about the link, I usually send it to you
Yes, that's right. Right.
really.
Okay.
So I'll try and do that
Yeah.
earlier. But
Yes.
I wanted to tell you this about Anatole, right?
Mhm.
One of my friends, one of the first readers of Rain. You remember I told you that I had a group of friends who I gathered around when I was writing the book, and I told them, "Okay, ladies, you're going to sit here and you're going to accompany me while I write this book." Well, one of them, who is now reading the book for the second time, right?
Yeah.
Uh, she fell. She. I'm sorry. Are you telling someone?
Sorry. She needed to get to another part of the house.
It's okay. It's okay.
She has a long braid. She has the veil. She has a long skirt.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay. So can I continue?
Yes, now she's gone.
Okay. So I was
Sorry,
telling
we're
you
in
that
the middle of the house.
no, no, no,
We're
it's all right. I was
just
telling you that
myself.
this friend of mine, she fell in love with Anatole Basile Tejo. She,
Yeah.
early on, I think you called him. I can't remember the word you used, which was perfect. But you know how Marie, his wife, when she first meets him, she thinks that he's enchanting and marvelous. And everyone who meets him thinks that he's a poetic and is oracular and like all these things. Well, my friend too, she absolutely loved him. You noted that there's something not quite right, right? There's a fly in the ointment, as it were. When I spoke to my friend about this, and I was like, you know what? Anatole is perfect in every way. He's beautiful, he's brilliant, he's beloved, and yet he does this, right? He actually participates in this transgression. Um, and he never seems to ever take responsibility for it in any meaningful or even acknowledge that he's done it, right? And
Oh, he was
her,
shattered by it. Hmm.
her response was, "No, Anatole can do no wrong," because, because she so loved him. And
Yeah.
I think to myself, this is such an interesting response because I think it parallels the response in real life to the transgressions of people who we cast as because of their beauty or their charm or their charisma, that they
Hmm.
can do no wrong. And Anatole Basile, he had a different name in one of the earliest drafts of the book. It was a
Yeah.
name that resonated with the names of some West African Senegalese intellectuals. I won't name which one because I don't want to implicate them. Um, but I do remember that it was around the time that I was finishing the manuscript that I forget who was a there was a there was a there was a French head of state who passed away recently. I think it was Mitterrand, maybe, or was it? No, it was Chirac, right? Was it Jacques Chirac? Yeah,
Chirac.
yeah, Jacques Chirac
Hmm.
and Africa. So I'm sorry, I completely misspelled that. Jacques Chirac. So no, they can't find it. Give me just a second. Chirac. Jacques Chirac plus. Um, I think Jacques Chirac is the one who. Yes, Jacques Chirac had this reputation as being a great lover of Africa, right? And let me see, when he died, if I could, yes, when he died, some of the most eloquent and sort of elaborate um, expressions of grief and condolence, right? And like some of the um, most deeply felt memorials came from African thinkers and heads of state from West Africa, right? They talked about him as a brother. They talked about how much he loved Africa and how important he was for the continuing robustness of France's relationship with West Africa. And in Chirac's history, you see him speaking out a great deal about the sort of exploitative injustices that Africa is subjected to. I'm not going to go too in depth about my opinion on that. But what really struck me in listening to these Africans talk about Jacques Chirac, they talked about him as a brother, they talked about him as a lover of Africa, they talked about him as a friend. It really brought home, now this happened after I finished Rain, it really brought home to me what the thing that I had sort of informed my composition of, or at least my development of
Right.
Nato Tejo, which is these African French intellectuals who end up being the ones who sort of set the pace or the tone for for Francophone Africa, for African
Yes.
international relations and what have you.
Mm.
So many of them, and not just in Francophone Africa, but even in the rest of Africa, so many of them receive their education in Europe, right? So many
Right.
of them end up sort of absorbing
Mm.
and ultimately championing the cause of Europe. They become essentially apologists, right,
Right. Right.
for Europeans. And I
Mm.
wanted to, like, I think Tejo comes out the way that he does because um, I know from the storytelling point of view that it wasn't about vilifying him as some sort of like cartoon African puppet, but rather showing the subjective experience of what it is like to be so thoroughly assimilated, right?
Right. To
And
have
you know,
internalized the oppressor.
exactly, and so much so that you don't even realize it. And he reaches the apogee of that because, like you said, he not only marries a French woman, he marries a French aristocrat with
Right.
really deep roots
And
in
then
sort of
betrays her.
in French and English, history.
And he
Um,
betrays both her and his student.
yes, yes,
Mhm.
and I dare say he betrays her, his student, and even Anna, because you notice the parallels between the this consecration ceremony, right,
Mhm.
with the perfumed water and the towel, right,
Right. Right.
where Hera and Solomon, Hera consecrates her husband, and then he
Yes.
consecrates her, right? So there's a reciprocal relationship there. But in the case of Anatole and Anna, only she does it.
Right.
And one could give all kinds of reasons why he doesn't do it. The fact remains that it's not reciprocal, and nor does it ever remain reciprocal. Except you
Right.
know that he feels a sting of conscience because when he sees Marie, even 30 years later, or not 30 years later, I guess what, 9 years later, oh, 10 years later, I guess, he never, but like he intentionally silences everything about that experience. He doesn't
Mm.
tell her much about it. Um, and so to me, this fly in the ointment, this not quite right that you're touching on, I think really embodies well the sensation one has watching these supposed leaders, African leaders,
Mhm.
take of it what they will
Yes.
without without accountability.
Right. Right. You remember
Hmm.
after last time we talked, I
Hmm.
suggested looking at the scene in Augustine's life
Hmm. Hmm.
and the fresco which is in
Ah,
San
yes,
Gimignano,
yes, yes. Hmm.
where Augustine is African,
Hmm.
but he's part of the Roman Empire.
Hmm.
His father is pagan and very
Hmm.
proud of him, very
Hmm.
like Anatole's father,
Hmm.
and arranges for his education. His
Hmm.
mother is Christian,
Hmm.
and you see in the fresco the schoolmaster, who seems kind,
Hmm.
come take the boy away to school.
Hmm.
The father is very pleased about this. The
Hmm.
mother is very worried. There she
Hmm.
is, her white, is innocent.
Hmm.
And then it's in sequence. You see the boy, his trousers down, being beaten on the buttocks, on the
Hmm.
back of a
Hmm.
prefect. This
Hmm.
is the abuse that's happening to teach him Latin,
Hmm.
Virgil,
Hmm.
who will be Dante's guide.
Hmm.
And then you see the same little boy, Augustine,
Hmm.
smirking beside his schoolmaster
Hmm.
at this other self he now rejects, who is
Hmm.
being beaten.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I think that's the progression or regression that we see with Anatole,
Hmm.
who
Hmm.
internalizes the abuse and the
Mhm.
violence
Mhm.
of the conqueror's education,
Mhm.
takes it in, and now can participate in doing the same oppression,
Yes.
accepting the same oppression,
With the
and doing
interims
oppression.
and with the interim step of having swallowed whole this objectifying view,
Hmm.
right? Where he reduces the idea of the African man and the idea of the African woman to these very stylized,
Yeah.
icons.
Whereas, yes, whereas you have Dido killing herself as
Mm,
Aeneas leaves,
mm,
and he's not empathic. Has He's more concerned with the empire than
mm,
he is with her grieving.
mm, mm, mm,
And I mean, it's and then you have Dante's use of Virgil as well
mm,
at the end.
mm, mm,
Oh, there's something about deeply troubling about education, especially
mm,
when it's imperial education,
mm, mm,
which
mm,
it is,
mm,
and
mm,
it's imperial education against Africa,
yeah, yeah, yeah. And
which is perhaps why Dante brings in Carthage right into the
mm,
heavenly realms with the
mm,
bees
mm,
and
mm,
Beatrice.
mm,
So in
mm,
a sense, his Dido doesn't. She had
mm,
already died,
mm,
Beatrice, but
mm,
instead, uh, Beatrice is not abandoned. I don't know how in Conrad's Art of Darkness also you get the split between the woman in Brussels, the intended, Kurt's intended, and the black African woman in the final, the horror, the horror.
You know, this dynamic, it's I'm listening to you, especially with that last final example, and um I think about the persistence of the notion that the Nato's or Anatole's betrayal aside, right? The trajectory of his life has been one sort of curated to legitimize his union with Marie, right? And yet also sort of casually accept his transgression with Adongo, right? So that the thing that an educated African man does, right? Especially a refinedly educated African man of great virtue, beauty, intelligence, potential, all of that. That the way for him to realize his greatest potential is by sealing the bond of marriage with a European woman. This is a thing. This is actually a cultural thing that you see repeated over and over and over and over again all over Africa. While at the same time, it it also permits for the objectification and utilization of the African woman without any of the legitimizing and supportive um, elements. Now, this I don't mean to generalize and say that this is what everybody does, but this it's a common phenomenon, right? Um,
Uses of power.
yeah,
You
and
get professors and students and so forth.
mhm, mhm.
Betrayals. Mhm.
What's interesting to me, and I think this is part of what the same friend who loved Anatole Basile, she's the same one who said that she thought Anna was intrepid. She didn't think Anna was brazen or in any way like she she did not like. I told her that my impression of Anna was like her behavior shocked me, right? Like I found myself always going, oh my gosh. But then my friend, um, excuse me, rather interpreted Anna's behavior as a woman who knows what she wants and goes for it.
Mhm,
And so
mhm,
it has had me reflecting, what does that say about the cultural norms around her? What does that say about the breakdown of certain like social structures around her, social structures of security around her, that it now falls upon her to pursue what she wants, regardless of its ethical implications. Because Anna's actions, if she did not know that Anatole was married at the beginning, it doesn't matter because she's actually set to marry somebody else, right? And um, she's the one who goes after what she wants, right? Certainly Anatole participates, but she's the one who initiates and follows through on that consummation. Um, the second time she does it, right? The second time she does it and conceives Hehra, which is what we see at the end of book 6. Um, she already knows that he's married. Do you know what I mean? And she knows that he's a father of a family, and besides also knowing him as the mentor of her husband and all of those things. But she wants what she wants, and she's completely unmindful of the cost of that. And she's like manipulative enough to bet her husband before she goes in search of Anatole, because that at least that way she can mask the conception of Hera. Because you know, to me it seemed obvious, but at one point someone asked me, wait a second, if she had this kid in Sierra Leone, how does Gabriel even think it's his child, right? But the person who asked me this hadn't noticed that last bit, that Anna had actually gone out of her way to make sure that Gabriel slept with Gabriel, this man she loathes, right? That she abhors. She makes sure that she beds him before she goes on this mission. And she moves like that elephant in Anatole's dreams, right? Where she's intent and she's determined,
mhm.
and she has to have what she wants. Um, so I wonder, like, I would be really, really, really curious to listen in on. My hope is that this sparks conversations, not just a scene, but like the book, that it sparks conversations. And I would be very interested to listen in on some of those conversations when it came to cultural issues, because you're right in that as charming and as enchanting as Anatole may be, his behavior raises so many questions, um, and a lot of paradoxical questions, a lot of paradoxical reactions, even in himself at the birth of the twins. Remember his reaction at the birth of the twins when several people seem to have this epiphany that he is Esther's father. Like he seems to have the epiphany too at that moment, right? Marie has the epiphany, he has the epiphany. Um, Anna has the epiphany because now it's so obvious that the kids are called are named, because of the kids' names. Um, but I think the description, the final description of him was, nobody noticed the effort it took him to keep his head from sinking and his heart from rising when he realizes that he's the grandfather of these children, right? Of these boys. Um, so I know I would be very, very interested. I'm still fascinated. Maybe because I knew him from the get-go, I don't feel the same way, but I'm so fascinated by so many readers who love Anatole. They just like, oh, he's so wonderful, he's so charming. But none of that kind of uh, n- like none of that adoration compares with the quieter and I think maybe more stable love that I've heard people express for Solomon, right?
Mm. Yes, yes.
People love Solomon in a different way.
Mhm.
Um, And I'm a little bit in love with him too. You know?
No, he is splendid, and because there is real reciprocity.
Mhm, mhm,
One senses that, in a sense, Anatole's marriage to Marie has this very romantic concept of him,
mhm,
but he is the dominant one,
mhm, mhm,
taken on the position of
mhm,
the imperial power over her,
mhm, mhm,
which is reversal of
mhm,
the
mhm, mhm,
reality.
mhm,
And no, it's no, these things are difficult, but
mhm,
the book has such power because it is dealing with things like that.
mhm,
And, and the amazing thing is how beautifully Hera comes out of all of that.
mhm,
She is completely innocent,
mhm,
despite the fact that there's all of this horror behind her.
mhm,
Really, I
mhm,
mean, the behaviour of Anna
mhm,
to
mhm,
Maya
mhm,
was despicable,
mhm,
and, which well, it was a flogging scene in Augustine,
mhm,
the trauma.
mhm.
We didn't get into Dante today.
Not very much, not very much at all, which I think is fine. It's fine, especially since maybe because we know that we're planning, you know, that we subconsciously know that we're planning to dedicate more of our time to Dante. I think we allow ourselves license not
Yeah.
to. I did mention him a couple of times. Shall we talk about Hera and Solomon's story? Would you like? Do you have any insights or questions about that? Because I'm really interested in what you think.
Well,
It's I see the again from reading this week. I was wondering about the train, like the role of the train in their story, right? Hera's great grandmother is the one who first sees the serpent come
right.
through to
The
Kisumu,
iron serpent.
the
Yeah.
iron serpent. And yet later, when she grows older, at the behest of her grandson, she takes this train. Now she's older, more mature. She's what, maybe
Right.
70
Right.
years old, and
Mm.
she takes it to go to Mombasa and back. And so there's a sense that it's normalized. It's no longer this sort of iconic menace. And Hera, she meets Solomon at the train platform. She's been traveling by train throughout Europe and getting to know him. Um, and and it is also a train that ends their story. So there's those sort of touches along the way, but then um, I have to say that my favorite part of their story is two mirroring phrases. Um, a lot of these mirroring phrases in Rain, they tended to just sort of spill out on their own, right? There was the mirroring of Marie's love when Marie fell in love with Anatole, where the first time she hears him, if I may, if you do you mind if I read a few passages?
Go right ahead. Yes.
Okay. So so um so this is when she first meets him, okay? And so it was that on a holiday party where all those young African men of promise and charm were introduced to their professional patrons and mentors, Marie d'Arcolevêque, a lover of music and landscape painting, heard the voice of the son of Tejo. It was deeply resonant, cultured, and round, the sound that it made possible only, surely, from one with a kind and open heart. His intellect, clearly incandescent, cast his strikingly sculptured visage and statuesque composure in such dazzling light that all who beheld or stood around him glowed from simply reflecting his splendor. and Marie d'Arcoux-l'Évêque marveled that such an enchanting creature could be. Raised in the bosom of a 1,000-year-old family with roots firmly anchored in Normandy, Marie-Madeleine Clémence d'Arcoux-l'Évêque had grown up to expect that when the time came for her to be married, her parents would arrange a suitable match, and she would naturally settle close to home. I'm going to fast forward to the end of this. So she forgoes the London season, and it says that it was the kind of thing where people knew that for the price of 6 months of concerts and dances and cocktail parties, the Franco-Norman debutantes from Maison d'Arcoux-l'Évêque, that the Maison d'Arcoux-l'Évêque sent along, served to sustain the tradition of conquest to civilize England that William, the Duke of Normandy, debuted in 1066 when he first took the throne. But with only the weak and the tired and the beaten left behind to sort through the nation's rubble in the twilight of its global dominion, priorities had changed. For 2 years after the armistice, Marie rolled up her sleeves every day to help rebuild what the Führer had rent. When she turned 17, she forswore the season and instead thought to become a missionary. That was the year that the École Missionnaire Saint-Louis sent its first class of fellows to Paris for training as Catholic priests and lawyers and doctors, including the most luminous among them, who went by the name of Anatole Basile Tejo. Marie d'Arcoux-l'Évêque was enchanted that such a marvelous creature could be. So I like the echo here of Marie d'Arcoux-l'Évêque marveled that such an enchanting creature could be, and then she was enchanted that such a marvelous creature could be. And in this story, so this is that love story. The love story that is Hehra and Solomon, they're in the cathedral, right, at Canterbury Cathedral, and Hehra is reading the inscription, right, on the tomb of the Black Prince. Standing apart and listening while she read, I think this is slightly different in the new edition, but that's okay. Solomon watched Hehra, intent and absorbed. This was perhaps the moment he would point to if ever asked when he could no longer see himself as something separate from her, or her as something separate from him. There was no flash of light, no thunderclap, just a sense that all was well with the world. And then later, allow me to just finish real quickly. Let me see, what was it? Beside her, so they're listening to the music, and then with each turn of harmony, the tide surged within, and soon Hehra just let herself weep without making a sound, unmindful of dissembling. Beside her, Solomon felt the heat rising from her brimming heart, and just as he had collected her words with shining eyes, he collected her silence as well, placing the palm of his right hand on the back of her neck with weightless tenderness. This was the moment that Hehra would point to if ever asked when she could no longer see herself as something separate from Solomon, or him as something separate from her. So this, I really like that.
Yes, but at the same time, Solomon is her Black Prince who
In what
doesn't
way?
live to be king.
Mm-hmm.
You get this
Oh, wow.
amalgamation of
Wow.
Solomon and the Black Prince, where she is reading to him, "As I
Uh-huh.
am now, you will
Uh-huh.
be,"
Uh-huh. Mm-hmm.
which is also on the
Mm-hmm.
Massaggio Trinity at Santa
Mm-hmm.
Maria Novella.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's beautiful. I had not even yeah, I hadn't seen that.
Well, it's sad because you've already got the intimations of mortality
Mhm. Mhm.
in the scene where they fall in love with each
Mhm.
other.
Mhm. Mhm.
But it is a very beautiful relationship.
Mhm. Mhm. And
Mm.
surprising in so many ways, isn't it?
That is,
I said surprising in so many ways. This I don't
Mm.
know why, but there's something about it that surprises me still.
Mm-hmm.
Like it
Yeah.
doesn't feel let me see.
Well,
It
what I
doesn't feel
love about
inevitable.
Hehra
Hmm.
is
Hmm.
there she is, this girl who's filled with energy,
Hmm.
and she's a citizen of the world in the real
Hmm.
sense. She's not. She absorbs it all innocently. I
Hmm.
don't think Anatole does it so innocently as
Hmm.
Hehra does.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, and she, and also Solomon, they they go from Africa to
Hmm.
continent to Europe to
Hmm.
England and then to America.
Hmm.
Um, they are world citizens
Hmm.
like
Hmm.
you,
Hmm.
and I hope I am a bit too. Uh,
Hmm.
that we sort of belong everywhere along
Hmm.
humanity,
Hmm.
but at the same time, you get the sense that with Alex and with Anatole, there's a kind of masculine way of assimilating to the culture in power and
Hmm.
not being able to see
Hmm.
where it's wrong.
Hmm. Hmm.
Whereas you get the sense that with Hera, she is capable of getting it in balance
Hmm. Hmm.
and sharing the music with the unborn twins.
Hmm.
Preparation for them.
Hmm.
That it's that she is going to be using culture as something that is shared and given.
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
It's
Yeah.
not something about Anatole is a bit narcissistic.
Yes, I see what you mean. I think I see exactly what you mean. The very fact, I think it was way in book two, book three, maybe, when there's this description about how even in Paris, when people gather around him,
Hmm.
they gather so that they might invoke in him this sort of African oracle, right?
Yes.
And
Hmm.
he's always placed on a pedestal
Right.
where he then gets to hold forth, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
And his como se dice
The
atteggiamento, his
capital
comportment,
letters.
right?
I cringe when I come to those capital letters.
Wait, which capital letters?
The African woman, the
Oh
African
my
man.
God. Yes, 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 yes. Exactly, you know? And the very fact that you remember he was the one who asked Gabrielle, like, do you know how much your people have suffered? Right? And Gabriel, when he thinks about his grandmother and he thinks about his bride to be, he
Yeah.
can't quite he doesn't initially see that because he's just living his life. He's not living his life as part of this story, this external story
Mhm.
of his oppression, right?
Right.
The oppression that Gabrielle will experience is entirely different, right? The kind of trauma that Gabrielle will experience is entirely personal and very, very intimate, and but it's not the sort of thing that is the stuff of poetry or literature or histories, right? And yet Anatole like wants him to see himself. It's the, like the initial idea. What's really interesting about that is Anatole comes off as this sort of like cosmopolitan man of the world
Hmm.
who can frame things and let him know, you as an African have a destiny to improve your lot, right? Um, and that it's a very sort of European savior mentality, right?
Yes.
So
Hmm.
while yes, he's an African, and yes, he's mentoring African men, he's doing it through the lens of the
Right.
European white savior mentality, right?
Hmm.
And I dare say that I think this is what might account for his, if not so much entitlement, but his
Hmm.
self exculpatory participation in Anna's, you know, I guess, yeah, in Anna's fantasy, right?
Hmm.
Because 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 by stylizing everything, the African man, the African woman, the, you know, and that being the thing that really like seduces her, right? That idea being what seduces her. um it's almost as if, because he is not actively the one who initiates anything, he could, if he wanted to, if we could hear what was in his head, he would excuse himself. Well, I didn't do anything. I was asleep when she came to me. And yet, once he was awake, because he is awake when it happens, he continues to participate, right? When she finds him years later, she's now a grown adult, he's a grown adult. Somehow, he again participates, right, in this project of hers. Um, and so, this sort of like, you know, this Pontius Pilate, I wash my hands of, you know, it's not, the devil made me do it. I think is the is his principal flaw. And I don't know where, he abdicated his agency and will. It would be interesting to discover, like, where is it that Anatole Basile Tejo abdicated his agency to make decisions about what is right and wrong, you know?
Yes. Well, yeah, I mean the part in the Paradiso where they're
Mhm,
discussing love and free will.
mhm.
But what Anatole is doing isn't love.
No, no, it's
It's
not.
willed,
Yeah,
but it's not the wrong kind of love.
yeah.
It's the Paolo and Francesca stuff. The book made us do it.
Mm, mhm, 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 mhm,
When I was in Attica State Prison talking on Dante, I mentioned how the souls in hell blame everyone else but themselves.
mhm, mhm,
One of the prisoners said, "Yes, that was me."
mhm,
My prison students would never have been able to say, and
mhm,
the
mhm,
12-step program and so forth.
mhm,
But souls in hell do pass off the blame to everything else.
mhm, mhm,
That,
mhm,
that they're
mhm.
there. And,
And what's really interesting about these souls in hell, every time they speak up to tell Dante their story, even as they are, you know, passing off the blame, the story of themselves that they're saying is a self-indictment,
yes.
you know. And
It is.
one of the,
Mhm. It's a kind of false confession, isn't it?
I don't know that it's false confession.
Uh-huh.
I think it's an unwittingly honest
Yes.
confession. They just don't realize they're confessing.
Mhm,
Um, they're there to plead their own case, because
mhm,
oftentimes they do it in the sense of, please go tell the world, or
mhm,
there's maybe a couple of, they're like, okay, just promise that you won't tell anyone about me, right? There's only a couple of those, they who are clearly too self-aggrandizing to want
mhm.
the world to know how low they've fallen, right? but
Yes.
but most of them are, you know, oh, have pity on me, and may the world also
Yes.
have pity
Right.
on me. But
Mhm,
having said that, here's what I find really interesting about the way their situation is set up. If you remember when they first arrive, right, and Minos judges them, right, his tail goes around, you know, the number
yes.
of circles it's supposed to go in, and they don't.
Mhm,
Well, what's really interesting is the way that episode ends is Dante says, dicono e odono, e poi giù sono messi, or yeah, sono messi, I guess. I don't remember the line. But the preceding, I think, three tercets goes into details about the dynamics. So these souls come up, there's a crowd of them. They show up in front of Minos, and each one speaks, says something to him. Minos's reaction, or his response, is only the winding of the tail.
yes. Mhm,
And now Dante summarizes the entire thing of dicono e odono e giù sono messi. So, so it is actually what they said themselves that is
Yes.
responsible for
Mhm.
where they're sentenced. People call Minos a judge. I don't think Minos is a judge. Minos is a sentencer.
Mhm.
It's the individual who comes in who actually
Themselves.
simply, it's almost like they allocute. There you go, that's a word. They allocute
Mhm.
their sin, their crime. And one could very well say, if we are to go by what we hear from them later, when Dante, a pilgrim, asks them, if we're to go by that and take it for granted that they said the same thing to Minos, right? They're all trying to make the case for their innocence, right? Like I'm not guilty because the devil made me do it, right? Or, these circumstances were beyond my control. I couldn't help it. I had no choice, all this sort of business.
Mhm.
Um, it's like all of that self-exculpatory stuff is rendered completely null and void in one of the most beautiful ways I can imagine. When Dante finally sees Lucifer himself, right? And he sees this grotesque monster, and he uses this beautifully paradoxical language by saying, if he was anywhere as beautiful then as he is ugly now, then he must surely have been truly splendid, right? So he doesn't actually tell you how ugly he is. He just creates this imaginary hypothetical comparison in your mind, and you just have to, and you've already been told that he's so ugly that he makes Dante think that maybe he's dead, right? Or like possibly, like he was so scared that he was sure he was dead. So this language that really embodies the ineffability of the extreme um, deformity and corruption of Lucifer is
Mhm.
so very powerful. So
Mhm.
now that's the context that we're living in. And it's a Lucifer who, his wings, his bat wings, right? It seems that they're flapping in order to free him from the ice in which he's transfixed. And yet their very flapping is what solidifies the ice even more. So all the new waters running into this well, into this region of hell, once the breeze from those wings hits them, they freeze anew, right? So in essence, you have a figure who is, his very action is responsible for his imprisonment and the perpetuation of that imprisonment,
Mhm.
which is the best metaphor for the fact that he's there by choice, right? It was his rebellion and his repudiation
Yes.
of the divine that that
Jealous of God.
earned, earned him this place, right? So that's a dynamic, and then I thought to myself, wait a second, students, every Dante class I've ever taught, we get to this part, they've read the episode, they come in and they're mystified. They're like, wait, that was Lucifer? That's Satan? Like all this time we've been coming down here, it's like, Prince of Hell, Prince of Lies, King of this, da, da, da. And all we have is this pathetic creature who can't even do anything for himself. What gives? Now, there's an American poet who once said something that earned him my eternal dismissal, like my eternal disrespect. And this was T.S. Eliot. When T.S. Eliot said something to the effect of, Dante's, I'm paraphrasing, Dante's great, he's a master of poetry, but in his portrayal of Lucifer, he drops the ball. He completely misses the mark because he ends up giving us the most bloodless and anticlimactic portrayal of Lucifer that one could possibly get, right? And T.S. Eliot was so disappointed, and he concludes with this incredibly, just like mind-blowingly condescending assessment. But since Dante does do everything else so well, we'll give him a pass on this one, right? Typical T.S. Eliot. So So I'm thinking to myself, T.S. Eliot is celebrated as this grand poet and great grand lover of Dante. How does he not understand what Dante just did? How does he not understand that Dante is not sitting there lecturing us about um, Lucifer's powerlessness, but rather he's demonstrating the absolute lack of agency to do anything to anybody else when he can't even do anything for himself. So
Mhm.
that any argument that the devil made me do it, right? That
Mhm.
Satan is all powerful and I can't resist him, ends up being proven to be rubbish because Satan doesn't even have the power to help himself, let alone to come and make you do anything. And it's one of the most beautiful ways to underscore the importance of free will, right? Throughout the Commedia.
Mhm.
And to 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 bring home the fact that uh, when someone abdicates their agency and transfers responsibility to another, that person made me do it, that person made me do it, that person made me do it. Um, it is simply compounding the sin, right?
Right.
Right now,
Mhm.
falsely accusing someone else for something that was your own choice to begin
Will.
with.
Mhm.
Hmm. Exactly. You know.
Which Satan had done in rebelling against God out of jealousy
Hmm. Hmm.
instead of. Ah, whereas Milton makes Satan magnificent.
And
Um,
I think that's a Satan that T.S. Eliot had in mind. Like he took
yes,
Milton's
yes.
Satan
Mhm.
as the archetype. And because he didn't find it in Dante, like magnified because of the
Mhm.
magnitude of Dante's work,
Mhm.
he couldn't see past his own inability
Yeah.
to actually find the text, you know?
Mhm.
But yeah,
Mhm.
you're absolutely right that Milton's Satan is magnificent, you know? And yet he too Milton does imbue him with that same tragic flaw that
Mhm.
Dante's Lucifer
Yes.
has, which
Mhm.
is there's a scene where he's describing Lucifer's flight
Mhm.
to Earth, right, from Pandemonium, which by the way I love. Like
Yes.
Paradise Lost is so fantastic.
Milton is splendid,
It's
right?
absolutely.
Yes, yes.
So, you know, remember that scene where he's described Lucifer like is hell bent, if I may say, on corrupting God's new, you know,
Yes.
toy. And so
Mhm.
he's flying through the cosmos, right, to Earth. And what's really interesting is again, I'm going to have to paraphrase, but I do remember just being so gripped by this description when he says, and he it turns into the present tense. So the narrative has been in the past tense, and then suddenly you have in the present tense, um, and fly though he and though he may fly or fly fast though he may or something like although he may fly as fast as he cannot fly from hell, for hell within him he
Yes.
carries, right?
Mhm.
And
Yes.
so the idea that that Lucifer's rebellion and repudiation is in and of itself the embodiment of hell, right?
Where's the microphone?
So
Okay.
sure.
No. Mm. Okay,
I think it's
it's
gone.
past. Mhm.
So there's no degree to which like trying to escape hell actually allows him to escape hell because it's something that resides within him. And that is as far as that is as close a parallel to Dante's Lucifer as I find. Only Dante's project is to also demonstrate that this Lucifer that we see, he embodies the very not just the powerlessness to affect anyone else, but the essence of what it means to be accountable for your own free will, right?
Mhm.
Because that first iconic repudiation of the divine
Mhm.
means and a divine that contains everything, right? This is one of the most beautiful thing about how Dante thinks that I think is so fantastic. There is the ineffable, right? There's the grand beyond the capacity of language to contain, right? And then there's the minutely practical, right? So that
Yeah.
you have this Ptolemaic universe, which is geocentric, and God, the final destination, is the ultimate container, right? The vessel that contains everything and is contained by
Yeah.
none, right? Which is all described as spherical, right?
Right.
So that repudiating communion with the divine, which contains everything, can only happen in one of two ways. Like if God, who has created all with free will and therefore must submit to the choice, right, of the willing soul, right? If a soul says, "I will have none of you, O divine one," right? The divine either has to eject the soul from within the all, but we've already been told that there's nothing beyond the all. There's no outside of the all to be, right? So this one that rejects communion has to find some place within. And in this spherical Ptolemaic universe, the farthest place from the edge of the sphere is the center.
Right.
That's the 0 point, and it's the only place one who repudiates belonging to the all can go, right? And so like, things like
And
that
there is
people, right?
right, right. And in fact, in the manuscripts I'm working with,
Mm,
where Brunetto is dictating to Dante, Guido, and Francesco,
mm,
he is describing if you've got the earth,
mm,
got a hole going through it, and you drop
mm,
a rock,
mm.
it will get stuck at the center.
Uh-huh.
And they were actually drawing this, and then Dante does it for
Mm,
Satan, and it's so um, and I there's this wonderful Romanian who was Minister of Culture, and then the government said no because he's talking about literature that's not Romanian, so they threw him
mm,
out. He was
mm,
actually as a physicist who's brilliant in music and literature, and he wrote a wonderful book on Dante in the
mm,
Eyes of Beatrice, which
mm,
isn't translated into English, and it should be. And he's pointing out how the sphere of God is with God at the center.
mm,
You turn it inside out, and
mm,
it's the earth at the center with Satan.
mm,
Satan as the parody of God,
mm,
Satan as God as being, Satan as non-being. Going back into your Boethian terms, um, it's I love that sense in Boethius when he describes God at the center, as its love, its being, its good. And the farther you go out to the periphery of the circle, the less you are. You become non-being. Sin is non-being. Evil doesn't exist. It's a kind of um, in that, and we don't think. I mean, even today, a watch face is round, and that goes back to this medieval sense of time and eternity. But we're still thinking too much in linear.
So
We've got
this is how the timeline at the
yeah,
beginning of Rain
yes,
became a radial timeline.
hmm
This one right here. Okay.
yes, yes,
albeit
exactly. hmm
albeit defined from a particular time to a particular time, because the one of the enduring mysteries of mathematics is how to square the circle, right? Like, so the notion of pi, which is an irrational number and
Right.
just goes on and on forever, is simply the ratio of the circumference to the diameter,
Yes.
right?
hmm
And because it's expressed as a ratio, It means that the size of the circle will change based on the size of the diameter. You can expand or reduce the diameter however much you like to make the circle bigger or smaller. And this is where, if the more radii of time you want, right? Obviously, the bigger you make the diameter, and the more time you can fit. This is from 1845 to present, around
Yes.
2020, right? But this could be also from, I don't know, 1600, which would mean making the circle bigger and therefore making these points more
Yes.
numerous. And I really like that idea so much more than a linear timeline, because you also get to see, I'm sorry, you also get to see,
Yes.
how
Now I
the
got it.
how the lives how lives
Yes.
affect each other, right? How, where
I.
they overlap. Oh, sorry.
Mm,
What am I doing? I can't see. I'm doing things backwards. How the different lives overlap each other, and how everyone is born at the beginning of their life. I know it
yes.
sounds like a terribly obvious thing to say. Well, of course, everybody's born at the beginning of their lives,
Mhm.
but rather than make the beginning of their lives like some linear point zero, how about have everyone's origin be essentially the same? We all start at the same tabula rasa point, and then our lives start to diverge and sort of, move out in time, even. Hence the growing separation. But the idea being that every unborn soul is coming from the same place.
Mhm.
It's part of what drives this idea of a radial timeline as opposed to a linear timeline.
Mhm.
So, anyway, my dear, so it is uh,
Pumpkin time.
pumpkin time. I like that, pumpkin time. Long past. This was wonderful. This is so. I wish I think we could still talk more about Hehra. I don't know. Before I close, maybe I don't know if there's anything more that you wanted to add about Hehra, or her life, or about the churches in England, about Westminster and
Yeah.
Canterbury. Anything that you'd like to say, and I'll just have a listen, and then maybe we'll wrap up then, if you like, or we can wrap up now.
Well, I think you've already talked about how the cathedrals are like forests in stone.
Mm-hmm.
At least what was good about Gothic architecture, which Blake called, is it was in conformity with nature, with
Mm-hmm.
the Fibonacci curves and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Whereas Blake saw modern architecture as like Stonehenge, about
Mm-hmm.
sacrifices, the
Mm-hmm.
boxes,
Mm-hmm.
the lintel post,
Mm-hmm.
more primitive architecture. And in fact, architecture has become more primitive out of
Mm-hmm.
the profit motive. You
Mm-hmm.
want to make it as cheap as possible,
Mm-hmm.
which is actually quite dangerous. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
at least the Gothic cathedrals, uh, they were brilliant in
Mm-hmm.
terms of the resilience, even when the terrible fire at Notre Dame,
Mm-hmm.
uh, so much did survive. And
Mm-hmm.
also the stained glass windows. That again is the Boethian thing. On the outside, you might have the Wheel of Fortune,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and that's where the marketplace is. And then you go
Mm-hmm.
in and you see the Madonna and
Mm-hmm.
the 12 apostles.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Dante is playing games like that with the shapes
Mm-hmm.
and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but you are right to see the stone, the frozenness,
Mm-hmm.
and and of course, what the extraordinary thing is that the architecture, Gothic architecture, is enemies become their enemies. Uh, America was more like Russia
Mm-hmm.
uh, during the time of the McCarthy hearings. Everyone was dressed just so, and then there was the hippie movement and the rebellion against that. It was
Mm-hmm.
terribly conformist. Uh,
Yes.
and then with the Crusaders fell in love with the Islamic world,
Mm-hmm.
and Gothic architecture is Islamic, and it
Mm-hmm.
became the super Christian architecture
Mm-hmm.
when it
Mm-hmm.
was actually the super Muslim architecture,
mm,
Ahmadi architecture.
mm, mm,
Became, also the adoption of Aristotle.
mm,
First, there was resistance, and
mm,
he was seen as heretical.
mm,
Then he was subverted and became used by the Inquisition
mm,
to Thomas Aquinas and so forth
mm,
as the most authentic form of theology. So we
mm,
keep going through these crazy patterns in
mm,
cultures where
mm,
we do adopt the other, but
mm.
negate the reality of that adoption, pretending it
Yeah,
didn't.
yeah,
So
yeah. That's, I think
they,
that's what's called appropriation, right? That is the ultimate sense of appropriation.
yes,
Yeah, mm,
which is in a sense what Anatole
mm,
is doing. And
yeah, I guess, yeah. Oh, my friend, if she watches this video, she's going to be heartbroken that we were so hard on Anatole.
right. I'd be a little scared of Anatole, I think.
Yeah. Well, imagine there are lots of Anatoles running around Africa. There's so
Yes,
many of them. There are so many of them, and everybody adores them.
yes.
They're beautiful, they're brilliant, they're incandescent, they're charming, they're
What,
oracular.
yes, what can happen? I can remember in Berkeley, in a married students' village
Mhm,
with my three children,
mhm,
and there was a Nigerian couple, and
mhm,
he was doing sociology of dreams.
mhm,
And it was wonderful, his argument. He was pointing out the common European dream is the examination dream.
mhm,
And you
mhm,
arrive at the examination room and you
mhm,
haven't studied and you're naked,
mhm,
etc., etc. And he was doing the sociology of how, what dreams are and so forth. And he had this absolutely beautiful wife. And, we really love that couple.
mhm,
But you haven't talked about female genital mutilation,
mhm.
how hard that must have been on the African women.
Well, the thing is, that's a culturally specific thing.
Hmm.
That's it's not a universal practice across
Right.
different ethnic groups. And it's not something that the Luo people do, right?
Good, good,
So it's not in the context of the story, it's not pertinent. And it
good.
doesn't, or at least it doesn't enter into the story because
Yeah.
there's none of the characters live it in
Mm.
at all really in any significant way. If this were a story that was set within a family where that was an issue, for example, um if they were set in Eritrea or in Ethiopia, where there are ethnic groups that did practice it, and it's something which came up, most in
Mhm.
the most sickening way in Indro Montanelli's justification for his pedophilia and basically
Mhm.
child
Mhm.
trafficking and
Mhm.
rape. When he described the young girl that he took for his quote
Right.
unquote
Mhm.
wife, he described the trauma of like the physical evidence of what that practice did to her and the effort he had to make to penetrate her.
Mm.
It's so grotesque that it's like it doesn't even bear thinking about. So this it doesn't figure into this story at all because
Yeah. Yeah.
it's not a quote unquote African problem because it's not,
No.
it's very specific to particular, yeah.
But to to think where this is practiced, the tragedy of that and interference in the natural love between husband and wife.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
Uh, that for her there can be no. enjoyment.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but
But you
I
know,
think,
outside of the effect that it has
mm,
on sexual union per se, it has, you know, that kind of practice has some deeply traumatic
yes,
implications just for health and
right.
well-being
Mm-hmm.
in general, and then ultimately even childbirth, you know. So the it's a brutalization that is
Right. Why do cultures do this? I mean, male circumcision,
you
female
know, I think this
circumcision
this I think this would be a good topic for conversation, but
later.
I don't have the knowledge, understanding, or the wherewithal to even speculate about
But
it.
it's almost as if we sort of seek to mechanize the human body to
Across the
embed.
world, different people do this, no? I mean, a lot of times, a lot of these systems of control
Hmm.
are practiced principally on women, right?
Practicing abuse and trauma,
On women, and they're
and also on men.
yes, on men as well.
Mm.
And yes, you're absolutely right on men as well. But and not but and ultimately, um, their end goal is to control people, right?
Yes. Hmm.
To package them in ways that are
To remove free will.
to remove. I don't know if they can remove free will. Maybe remove the exercise of it, or remove the will
Hmm.
to exercise
Hmm.
will, right? Remove
Yes.
the will to exercise agency,
Hmm.
because you look at any creature, human or otherwise, that has been brutalized, and you will find that their primary concern is self-preservation, and they will avoid anything that could ignite any more, or that could, you know, bring on any more trauma. And so that is a way of sort of getting people to internally imprison themselves if you traumatize them enough, so that they all they want to do is
Hmm.
avoid being traumatized. So they will
Right.
they will conform, they will acquiesce, they will stay
Hmm.
docile, they will even
They,
betray others just to avoid the
hmm,
trauma.
hmm,
But it's a
which is
very
what
effective
the
tool.
fresco of Augustine's
There
education
you go.
is about.
There you go. So the violence as a tool of control is truly insidious, because the one who is
Which,
violated then
mhm.
can then like sort of perpetrate that violence on others, right?
So
Um,
this leads right into your next book.
mhm, which is book 7, the one we're going to talk about next week.
Yes.
The final line of book 6 is the final lines of book 6 are Hera taking her baby, where she goes, when at last a new life came of the union of that African man and this African woman, Anna named the child Hera, the only name her devotion knew, a name bespeaking love. And then we have war followed fast in the wake of Vasco da Gama's Second Armada. So it ends with love and this book ends in love, and the next book starts with war. And to sort of tie the bow on the through thread of um, Hera's story from the end of book 5 throughout book 6 and into book 7 is, um, here we get the story of how how the name Tejo came to Sierra Leone, how Anatole Basile Tejo, who ends up being the father of Hera, he had told Marie about how his ancestors came from the sea through the mangrove forest. But it's only in book 7 that we get to see that. We actually see it in motion. It's revisited again because it's one of Hera's dream walks, right?
Mhm.
um, when she comes to find João de Souza. But then João de Souza, this Portuguese monk, when he then escapes bondage with the other Moors and Negroes who are being held in bondage, and they disappear into the Linus Mountains, that's when this figure called Tejo of the Linus Mountains is born, and his descendants sort of
Mhm.
trickle down all the way to the generation, to the twins who are about to be born. Right. So this is where Hera. It's really interesting because you had mentioned this, I think, in the first meeting we had. You had said, yes, there's you know, we have the story of Maya, but you said, Julie, and I remember this very clearly. You said, ultimately, this is Hera's story. Like ultimately, we meet her when she's, beginning to give birth, and the story ends with her children. Um, and in retrospect, as a reader, I'm finding these threads that bear out your assessment, including discovering, that this book 7, which is a book of war and violence, has in it a nugget. It's the only moment of peace in book 7, right? It's the only moment of real tranquility when this group goes to find refuge in the mountains.
Mhm.
And Jean de Souza sort of sings his new name into being, right? Like, the Dicono e Ordino e Giusono Messi, these 63 people, they also told their story. And upon telling their story, their new friends in the new village now give them a name based on their story. Um, and so I guess so book 6 really is a celebration of Hera, right?
Yes, it is. It
And
is. Yes.
so much of it.
And I do love arriving on the train station platform with all of the books. And because, I talk about how Dante's Commedia is a
Mhm,
library of books.
mhm,
And
mhm,
there she is. She's a
mhm.
library of books.
Yeah. And she's like, when they ask her about it, she's like, oh, don't worry. I'll want to have them all in my head. So I won't have to carry around the actual books. It'll all be in my brain.
Prometheus, his philosopher, told him when he
Uh-huh.
was lamenting the loss of his ivory and crystal
Mhm,
bookshelves and
mhm,
all of their books. And she says, but you remember the books.
mhm, 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 mhm,
We
mhm.
haven't lost them.
You
Although
know,
I've carted this library in Hehra, Diamanta has counted them, and they're in the thousands. I've got
oh.
them from England to America to
Mhm,
California to Illinois to
mhm.
New Jersey to Colorado
Oh my
to
God.
Sussex to Italy
And these
with
are
a
all books.
balance of my life savings. I've refused to give up the books.
Uh-huh, uh-huh, uh-huh.
I'm not
Fantastic.
like Prospero. I'll burn my books. I
Mhm.
won't.
No, 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 no. And I'm so proud that now this is one of your books, that this is one
I
of the
love
books in
having
your
it.
library.
Yes.
I'm so happy
Thank
about
you.
that. I'm so
Thank
happy
you
about
for
that.
the discussions,
Yeah,
which
absolutely.
I look
Absolutely.
forward to all week long.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I have to say one thing. Oh, is it going to be too late to talk about it next week? I realized that if we have other speakers coming to join us, right? Remember,
Hmm.
we talked about doing it at noon your time, which would be 6 a.m. over here. I realized that if we have other speakers come to join us, we'll be asking them to wake up at 6 a.m. if they'll be
We'll
here
be asking them to what?
to join us at 6 a.m.
Right.
And I don't know if they would do that.
Okay, right. Well,
Shall we think about it and then
Desmond, I'm not
maybe?
sure where he is at the moment. He's working for the MLA.
Yeah.
Malcolm Whitey is in Cambridge, so he's
Okay,
all
okay. So he'll be in the same time zone
right.
you are. Okay. Maybe we can find a middle ground. I don't know if we can find a middle ground.
Yes, yes. Okay,
Okay.
right.
I don't know.
Yes.
I'll think through.
It'll work out somehow.
Okay.
And
Okay.
probably they're too busy being men
Yeah,
to actually have time for us. And
it's
because
okay.
we are, it's quite extraordinary how. And I think it's very good that
Mhm.
we're finding a sphere
Mhm.
where, I mean, it's been such a battle.
Mhm.
Victorian women
Mhm.
had
Mhm.
to become governesses in order to be able to be educated. They
Mhm.
had to educate to be educated
Mhm.
because they
Mhm.
were barred from schooling.
Mhm. Mhm.
And then we were able to get into the universities.
Mhm.
But it's all very recent. And
Mhm.
in a sense, we have been excluded from the world
Mhm.
of the book
Mhm. Mhm.
for
Mhm.
centuries.
Mhm. Mhm.
I'm glad we're back in it.
Yes. Yeah. Me too. Well, my dear Julia, thank you so much. Um,
I think
Wonderful
we need to
questions.
take that. Yes.
No, it's wonderful questions, and the what you said about the cathedrals will have me thinking, reflecting for some content, quite some time. And I truly
Right.
appreciate that. It's wonderful seeing you, and I look forward to next week. Okay, my
Right.
dear. Mwah. Okay, take care. Sleep
Thank you.
well.
Yeah,
Sleep
and
well.
you too. Right.
Okay, bye, dear. Bye.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Good
Yeah.
night.